Ever since the release of Shining Revelry, there have been a ton of brand new decks that are currently running the meta. But there's one deck in particular that I think is criminally underrated. So if you've been anywhere near the ladder or you've joined any limitless tournaments for TCG Pocket like Ursuday's Pocket Weekly, you're probably sick and tired of seeing the Darkrai EX and Giratina EX deck, which did just win the last Pocket Weekly tournament. And the reason that this deck does so well is because you're able to passively attack with Darkrai EX on the bench, while Giratina EX produces its own energy so that you can then attack with it. The other deck that you've probably seen everywhere is the Giratina EX and Mewtwo EX deck, which did actually place second in the last Pocket Weekly tournament as well. Which this deck actually works similarly to the original Mewtwo and Gardevoir deck, but instead of Gardevoir, you're producing energy with Giratina and using your Dawn card in order to feed Mewtwo that extra energy that it needs so that it can Psy Drive. And like I said, currently these two decks are running the meta. They're everywhere on the ranked ladder, and of course they just place first and second in the biggest TCG Pocket tournament that's out there. However, the current deck that is the bane of my existence, and I somehow manage to run into it every single time I'm on the ladder. I swear they only search for me. But it is the Meowscarada and Beedrill deck. Now what's crazy about this deck is there's actually only one EX Pokemon in it, and there's only one copy of it, and that's Beedrill. The rest of the deck relies on you being able to set up your Meowscarada, which has the attack Fighting Claws, which has a base power of 60. However, if the Pokemon in the active spot is an EX Pokemon, this attack does 70 more damage, giving it a whopping 130 damage for just 2 energy. And considering that most of the meta decks right now are all based around EX Pokemon, if your opponent is able to set up Meowscarada before you're able to do anything with your EX Pokemon, Meow Meow kind of eats them up. What's worse is that it has 140 HP. So if you're trying to attack with things like Darkrai or even things like Giratina, this thing will live on 10 HP, even from a full force 130 Giratina attack. Not to mention, this deck also runs Giant Cape, which further increases Meowscarada's HP, as well as other support cards like Red, Erica, and Cyrus in case anybody tries to swap out a hurt Pokemon. You can just bring it back to the front. But on top of the trainer support cards, the synergy in this deck is actually insane once you actually fully think about it. Starting with Sprigatito, for just 1 grass energy, you're able to put a random grass Pokemon from your deck into your hand, which makes finding your Floragatos so much easier, as well as your Meowscaradas, which is kind of imperative when it comes to a stage 2 deck like this, since obviously you do have to evolve twice before you're able to go in for your big attacks. On top of that, this deck has a ton of disruption baked into it, and that's all thanks to the Beedrill line, since once you evolve your Weedle into a Kakuna, you're actually able to paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon, possibly preventing them from doing any damage, unless they're able to flip their coins, of course. On top of that, if you're able to actually find your Beedrill EX, you can hit your opponents for a solid 80 damage. However, like I said, disruption is key in this deck because it also makes you discard a random energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So if they're anything like Mewtwo's or Giratinas, that could actually be devastating, since you could prevent them from using their big attack until the next turn. And by then, it's sometimes too late. Beedrill also has a pretty decent HP stat as well, coming in at an HP stat of 170, which means that it is also able to live a Psy Drive for Mewtwo, barring a red, of course. But when it comes to this deck, one card that seems to have a vendetta against me is Team Rocket, which this card is literally the most annoying card to go up against if you are something that takes a while to build up energy like a Giratina or a Mewtwo, or even something like an Arceus. Anything that takes multiple energies to power up, because if your opponent pulls out this card, they flip a coin, and however many times that coin lands on heads, you have to discard that amount of energy from your active Pokemon. Then considering it's me and I have the world's worst RNG, they will quite literally flip 5 heads in a row, and I'll just sit there and get hit and just cry internally. But the reason that I say that this deck is super underrated is because not a lot of people are running it. People are talking about it, but I don't run into as many of these decks as I do, say, the Giratina EX and Darkrai EX deck, the Mewtwo and Giratina deck, or even the Arceus and Dialga deck. I'll even run into more Gyarados and Charizard decks. But I think if you're able to focus on disruption for this deck, this has the potential of basically walling EX decks. Especially since, like I said, thanks to Meowscarada's 140 HP stack, coupled with Giant Cape, you're able to escape getting one-hit KO'd by a lot of the big attacks from other EX Pokemon. And what's worse is that they can't even use Red against Meowscarada, since Meowscarada is not an EX card. So they're forced to kind of just hope that they have like a Giovanni or something to try to get a little bit more damage on it. Meanwhile, this deck is able to use Red against EX Pokemon. So while you're already doing a whopping 130 damage, add a Red to that and you're doing 150, on par with Mewtwo Psydrive. But you don't have to just take my words and my experience for it. The results kind of speak for themselves during the last Pocket Weekly, where it placed 9th. So it was in the top 10. And before anybody starts saying that it was just luck, this deck actually had a 47% win rate, which is actually great, especially in comparison to the Giratina and Darkrai EX deck, which has a 50% win rate. So it's almost on par with the #1 meta deck that's currently out there. So I don't know, if I were you, I would definitely invest in some Meowscarada and Beedrill stock. Obviously this is just my opinion, but I would definitely love to know what you guys think about this deck, or if you think there's any other decks that are also underrated. I feel like I'm definitely gonna get the Wug Trio comments. Personally, I think that that deck is definitely a gamble, and it would probably do me dirty, but like I said, I would love to know what other decks you think are underrated, and if you think that maybe I'm wrong and maybe Meowscarada isn't underrated, and maybe it's overrated. But that is gonna go ahead and wrap it up for today's video. Hopefully you guys found this video entertaining, and if you did, I kindly suggest that you consider subscribing so that I can continue to make content for you guys. And if you were already subscribed and you would like another way to support the channel, feel free to check out the merch store. There is a link down below in the description that takes you to not only my merch store, but also all of my other socials so you can keep up with what I'm doing on a daily basis. But thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you to those of you who have joined the channel as members. I appreciate you all so much. I love you guys, and I will see you in the next video. Bye guys.